now. And we'll jump in.
Okay, great.
So good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is our monthly candidate pledge training, and I'm joined this evening by our New Jersey chapter leader and candidate pledge pro, Marie Henselter Kimmel. Marie has been huge in helping us put this candidate pledge program together this year. We've been working together to essentially operate and improve the candidate pledge program, and we're looking forward to sharing some of that work with you this evening. We put together an agenda. We have a few things to cover tonight that I think you'll find interesting and helpful in your candidate pledge work. We want to discuss how to promote candidate pledge work in the press, including how to get a question into a newspaper questionnaire and start to build relationships with newspapers. We're also going to spend some time talking about messaging, so volunteers can know which issues and phrases resonate most with people of different political backgrounds. And then for the last 20 minutes or so, we want to open it up for discussion and give you the opportunity to ask questions, share some of the challenges you're facing, give some feedback about what's working in your state. And before we get started, I just wanted to take a few minutes to appreciate the great work that is happening around the country. We have a tendency, I think, to want to just jump right into the work, but there's been some incredible progress. So I wanted to share that with you this evening. When we set out to launch the 2022 Candidate Pledge Campaign, we knew that total pledges were not necessarily going to be as important as the balance of pledges as we start to try to shift our strategy to pull in people of all different political affiliations. So we decided to shoot for a split of 45, 45, 10, meaning that we would get 45% from Republicans, 45% from Democrats, and 10% from undecided, independent, third party, like another category. Now, to give you some perspective, prior to 2022, our statistics looked like it was about 78% Democrats who had signed our pledge, 7% Republicans, and then about 14% in that undecided category. With a little caveat that some of our data is currently not complete. So there were like maybe a third of the pledges that I couldn't tally in there. So that's only 2/3 of our total pre-2002 numbers. But to compare that to what we've done this year, for Republican pledges at 7% prior to 2022, we're up to 34% of total pledges in 2022. So that's incredible progress as we shifted our strategy. So 34% of total pledges this year have been from Republicans, 50% from Democrats, and 16% from unaffiliated third-party independent candidates. So it's much more in line with the balance that we were hoping to strike, and I appreciate everyone being so responsive and helping to get that done. Yeah, great work. I think it's a reflection of the work and also just the commitment to our mission. And yeah. Now, as we mentioned in the first training, we're excited to share a new candidate pledge at every meeting. And Marie is now going to share with you some of the recent pledges that we've pulled in.
You're going to share your screen, right, Chris?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So the New Jersey people cannot answer on this one. What I'm going to do is these are 3 candidate pledges that we have obtained from New Jersey, and I want you to pay attention to the quotes on the pledge graphics, because I want you to see if you can tell me what party they belong to. This first one, Greg Neely, this was actually a candidate pledge that we got because we had asked him to participate in a candidate panel that was cross-partisan. We had an independent, a libertarian, a Democrat, a Republican, and a Green party candidate. And Greg signed the pledge and he said, money plays too big of a role in politics. People should only be allowed to donate to a particular office, not candidate. Total donations should be divided equally among candidates for that office, so everyone's messages can be heard equally.
Oh, that's an interesting concept.
Let's see the next one.
That must be an independent or a Green person.
Okay, that's a good guess. Nicholas Ferrara. We must provide for more equitable campaign finance policies to stop big money donors and corporate interests from unfairly influencing election outcomes. The ultra wealthy have too much influence and power over the process, and their interests are often contrary to the interests of average citizens.
It's a Democrat. Right?
All right. I'll tell you at the end. Let's
I'm
see the
with
last
Nancy.
one. Damon Galdo. The influence of money in politics has turned civil service into a self-serving careerism catering to special interests. Money for the public good instead goes to politicians who don't serve the people. I will fight the influence of money in politics and serve as an example of public service. All right, non-New Jersey people, Nancy, you've weighed in on two. What do you think the third one is?
Well, it sounds like a Republican, but
Yeah, I'm with Nancy, independent and then Dem and then Republican based on their quotes.
And where's our other, we had one more person, but maybe she jumped off. Anyhow, they're all Republicans. All
really?
three are Republicans. Yes.
Wow.
And actually, Greg Mealy ran as a libertarian previously, and he's running as a Republican this time. Or actually, he tried to run as a Republican. He's shifting off to the next race because he didn't understand the that he had to have the registrations, the certain number of registrations we have closed primaries here in New Jersey. So we had to have Republican voters, registered voters, sign his petitions, and he didn't make it on, but he's going to be running again. So yeah, they're all Republicans. So
I've never seen anybody say that it should be for a specific office.
Yeah,
and
that's an interesting idea.
It's like, why would you do that? You're going to give the money to the federal government or a state government to
Well, it's kind of like public financing, sort of.
Well, not really.
Yeah.
But
So, I just want to point out that I think sometimes when we have seen a partisan support for the previous amendment resolutions or non-support, and we shouldn't necessarily be biased by that. That things have changed, messaging has changed, and I want to kind of go over a few of the things that we did differently here in New Jersey that I think has made the difference. We had not had much success previously in getting pledges signed by Republican candidates. New Jersey has a total of 12 congressional districts. And this year, so far, we have 4 Republican congressional candidate pledge signers. Our primary is back on June 7th, so we are still working to get some of the nominees in place. We have 10 incumbent Dems and 2 incumbent Republicans. So we're still going to be working, but we have 4 already, and that's 3 more than we have ever had on a pledge campaign initiative before. And I think our improved success with 3 different changes that we did differently. We used a particularly conservative messaging initial email request for them. We were more persistent in our contacts with the candidates. I think previously we tried like 2 or 3 times maybe, and we kind of gave up. We're like, okay, well, they're never going to answer us back, so we're just forget it. This time we really went more after some of the guidance that some of the other state leaders, like especially Laura Nipmeyer and Ashwari Solahab, had used, and said really five times it seems to take. So we really have been more consistent. We've tried to make calls. A lot of times we either can't get a phone number or they don't answer the call, but we have repeated emails with inclusion. For instance, on the second round of emails, we included a press release that we had published about our efforts here in New Jersey to get pledges signed and why we were doing it and what we were asking them to support. And we included a link to that press release in our second round of requests or reminders. Hey, we're still out here. We still asked you, what do you think? And then the third thing that we did was that we had used our list of supporters, state supporters, people who want to hear about what we're doing, not people who come to our meetings. And we put out, because when we used that list to generate letters to our incumbents for our NCLC last year, so we knew what districts they were in. And we sent them out specific information as to who all their candidates were of both parties, because the 2 closed primaries were June 7th at the time. It said, if you care about money in politics, you could really help us by sending this little template email and add in a little information about why you care about money in politics and send it directly to the candidates. We know, we've heard, right, from the Congressional Management Foundation about how powerful it is for incumbents to hear from their constituents about an issue. Well, I can guarantee you from now having talked to them, most of these candidates don't ever get an email from their voters, so their potential voters. So I know that 2 of our 3 additional candidate pledges by Republicans came after we got a number of those emails sent to the candidates by tapping our statewide list. And I'm sure that list is a little rusty because of everything that's been going on, you know, in the political spectrum in the last 2 years, but that did seem to help. So I just wanted to kind of go over those things. And I wanted to show just the difference in the 2 emails that we use. So first, this is what we use for our sort of what we call our liberal or middle of the road. We use a subject line of, to the candidates, invitation to show voters you'll work for them. And this is our, this is our spiel. The first, paragraph is just, we use this opening paragraph and try to include some information from their candidate website. If we, get some pertinent things, like particularly this year, especially for the Republicans, quite a few of them used support for the Stock Act. That's a piece of a proposal in Congress in the House to stop congressional members from being able to trade individual stocks. And particularly here in New Jersey, it was a factor because one of our Democratic congressional members is under an ethics investigation for doing so. So something like that would have made an allusion to, that this is similar in terms of the power of money in politics. So these are the highlighted difference. This is the wording for the liberal. We urgently need to reform the problem of concentrated and unlimited money from wealthy donors, corporations, unions, and special interests into our elections. How we finance elections currently is unfair, unrepresentative, and takes too much of your time and attention away from constituents and voters. I included this, and that wasn't, I don't believe, in the main template that we had initially put out for the candidate pledge. The American National Election Studies Survey of 2020 found that a record high 84% of Americans surveyed believe governments run for the benefit of a few big interests, not for the benefit of all. And I put a hyperlink in there. The same survey showed a record 61% agreed that people like me don't have a say in what the government does. I put another hyperlink. For our freedom to be represented in our government again, we need a constitutional amendment, a series of disastrous Supreme Court. And so this is talking about basically the Citizens United part. And this is kind of, it's pretty much what our messaging has been, I think, from American Promise. The other 2 things I did was I actually included what the pledge is in here. And then at the bottom, other than the 1-pager that linked to, I put a link to the examples of Democratic support that we had included in the candidate pledge handbook. Gave them information about signing if they wanted to, and put the little disclaimer here at the bottom. So that's kind of what we've all been doing before. Let me just bring up what, switch this. Sorry guys, 1 second here. Conservative, there we go. All right, so let's view full screen. Okay, so the difference here, same opener. The difference here is I used most of the language that was in, there was a few different options of emails, but this is the one I used for the conservatives. Across our great nation, concentrated money from self-interested elites dominates our elections, drowns out the free speech rights of your future constituents, and corrupts competitive free enterprise with pay-to-play crony capitalism. And again, cited the information about how the belief that government is run for the benefit of a few big interests and people like me don't have a say. And then for our freedom to be represented in our governor, again, we need a constitutional amendment too. enable each state and district to govern its own elections, free of dominating outside and special interest influence, increase the political representation of your constituents, ensure your constituents don't have to buy their political voice to be heard, and foster more competition, more free speech, and better debate in elections. And then at the bottom, I linked to the letter from former Senator Al Simpson and New Hampshire State Governor Jim Rubin's on our board, two conservatives. So the key thing here is that we want to distill for the conservative messaging that they seem to, the idea of money having too much influence in government resonates with conservatives too. There's a lot of concern too about the people not being heard by government, which is similar. I mean, that's both sides of the aisle. And I heard that from all of the Republican candidates that I spoke to when we were in the process of getting them to sign and doing their pledge quotes. And the whole idea of reducing the influence of out-of-state money, state sovereignty, foreign money, this whole, and we've talked, I think, lately we've been talking about that kind of messaging in the newsletter and so on. And Chris has some more information about that from some other sources that we have.
Yeah. Thanks,
May
Marie.
I ask a question, Marie? You shared your conservative language and stuff, and so I've sent out emails to the Republican. Do you put yours in an attachment or you put it in an email along with the logo? Because the way you're showing it, it looks like an attachment.
No, I copy that whole thing into the email.
Okay. Yeah, because it's, to go to an attachment is.
No. I take this and copy it right into the email with the logo at the top.
Yeah, and I guess what I've tried to do is I took your language, and there was one Republican who signed, so I said the subject line was join with Delegate Tim Anderson, who supports, along with Republicans getting money out of politics, trying to highlight that there are other Republicans.
Yeah, anytime you can do that, that's definitely helpful.
Nice. Any other questions for Marie before we drill down a little bit more into the messaging?
No, but I would like to ask Chris, because I mean, you sort of at the beginning of this, you said you want to get 500 pledges. How many do you actually have? I mean, you talked about the percentages, but we really don't know how many pledges. And I noticed on your website, you've done a great job of trying to improve it. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it's a constant battle on the website's side. And I've noticed in recent conversations that digital is feeling much more confident in the processes and getting caught up with some of the issues. So that's really promising. Yeah, so there was just to give you some context about the goal of 500, there were some numbers reported that were we had gotten 400 one year, 420, those numbers, but the numbers included duplicates from previous years. And so we're trying to go back to now identify unique pledges in previous years to get a better sense of what a realistic goal should be. So 500 based on what we've done in previous years really isn't a realistic goal for new pledges this year, but I think we're at about 40 pledges so far. Most of the pledge work in the past has been has been done in August and September. So I think we're still hopeful that we can, do maybe 200 to 300, which I think is closer to where we've been in the past.
We don't think that we don't think that we have all the California and Minnesota pledges because they were doing their own graphics, and it doesn't seem like they're in the system yet.
We only have a few Minnesotans in there, but we don't have any Californians. So anything that Laura is doing would be on top of that 40.
Good.
And just a technical issue, because I do my own graphics just to get it done quicker. I'm getting better at Canva. And then I send them to Zai. And I didn't realize, okay, I didn't enter that. So yesterday or the day before, I went in and then put in all the information about the people who I did the graphics for, right? And so just so that they show on Virginia. I mean, it's a little bit confusing for those of us who are sort of thing. Okay, I'm happy to do my own graphics, but then I didn't realize I had to put the data in for the candidates.
Yeah, and I think in like the next couple weeks, you may actually want to try submitting one through the site and see how fast you get a graphic back. Maybe even just as a test, you can make your own graphic still. But I think the process is going to be significantly quicker. I think it probably already is, but I think after, we all sort of get back from where we have a company-wide retreat, but once we get back from that, I think things will be expedited. So, yeah. All right, so I wanted to dive in a little bit more on the messaging that Marie started to touch on directly. And Joan just asked a question about the logo. Yeah, Joan, I can send you information about how to get a logo up into the top of the email. It's pretty easy. Can help you with that.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. So I linked the handbook in the chat just because everything that I'm about to show you is linked in the handbook. So if you want to access it after the presentation, you'll have access to do so. And I'm going to share my screen because I actually screenshotted some stuff that I wanted to share with you, show you. We have a few resources in there that actually weren't created by American Promise, and some of these were clipped from them. So I just wanted to give you some context about where it came from. A lot of this stuff is applicable to what we're working on, but some of it is maybe not exactly focused on our issue. So we'll try to pull from it what we can and leave the rest. So we wanted to go over like, what are the phrases that are impactful? What are the phrases that work? What are the phrases that are actually hurtful or harmful? And then maybe what are phrases that work on the left versus on the right? So this is based on research that was done to look at what framing, when you're talking about money in politics, has the biggest impact to move voter support or legislator support. And these are the issues they came up with, which is equal voice. So, irrespective of party affiliation, basically everybody has an equal say in the process. Barriers to running, right? It was really hard to get people on the ballot if they're not already well-connected, wealthy individuals. Out of balance, our current system produces an unrepresentative democracy, essentially keeps power concentrated at the top. And then when wealthy special interests make large contributions, the legislature, we all pay the price. There are additional consequences from that. And I think also in this term is like, we all have a price to pay for our democracy, which is, getting involved in this work to try to protect it. And then to kind of tie that to what American Promise believes, so we've revisited our values recently as we've, tried to build a strategy that's going to get us to our goals. And a lot of these are very similar to what we just saw from the other research, equality, equal voice, right? Service goes back to price we pay, barriers to running, competition. Freedom, right? Regulation of power is power at the top, goes back to equality too. So, and if you haven't already familiarized yourself with the new, website and some of the values, these are listed on the website. I think that it's really helpful in being able to talk about this issue with a broader audience. Going back to the other resource that we were looking at, so this is aimed at voters, but I think it can work with elected officials and candidates as well. So we have to be clear in communicating that there are practical and achievable solutions that'll strengthen our democracy and reduce the power of special interests. So I think part of this is framing things in a positive light, because it's easy to get really discouraged and make it seem like there's nothing we can do, but we have to try to frame things in like a way that actually seems achievable and like something that we have the power to change. So everyone participates is when we're talking to legislators, talking about I think when I look at this, like I'm sure that they don't want to spend all their time groveling for money from very wealthy people. So if I'm talking to a candidate or an elected official, it's like, wouldn't it be great if your constituents were more involved, if you didn't have to go and talk to these major donors and spend all of your time raising money? Everyone's voice is heard. This is a tough issue. This free speech, right? This is what what the opposition to this movement has used as a way to essentially get to where we are. It's what led to the Supreme Court decision, and it's why a lot of it's why the opposition tends to oppose this issue. So, is reframing that idea of that we all have an equal voice, or free speech, that money actually isn't free speech, that it limits free speech. Everyone knows, so disclosure is a thing that tends to be more supported on the right than on the left. So when we're talking about issues, sometimes we don't want to just go right for the solution, is talking about some of the problems that that they might care about and how this would address those problems. So talking about being able to understand who's funding the campaigns. This identifies how to get there. We need to tell them what our plan is. That's a constitutional amendment, that we know how to get there and we have a plan to get there. And then this one I don't think really applies to what the work we're doing. Everyone is accountable. And then this was great. I thought was great. They listed some things to say and some things not to say. So encouraged to use words like barriers to running, equal voice, equal say, and everyone's voice should be heard, instead of words like corruption. And when I read this list, I actually felt like this was really good for when you're talking about legislators, because you don't want to paint the legislator as the problem as you're asking them to do something about it. So trying to frame it in a way that empowers them to take action and not feel attacked can be useful. So of, by, and for the people, everyday people, ordinary Americans, everyone participates, every vote is counted. Positive framing. Don't say individual. Do say out of balance. Don't use unresponsive. Again, that sort of puts blame on the person you're talking to. Wealthy special interest. So talking, knowing your audience and talking about who the boogeyman is. I think, knowing the different names too, George Soros versus, the Koch brothers, or, corporations versus unions, is knowing who the enemy is. Free and fair elections. We deserve a real democracy, and rather than campaign finance reform or overturning Citizens United, which tend to be more terms for the left. Political rules unfairly favor the rich, or political loopholes, rather than inflow of money or rising tide of campaign cash. And there's a few others down here. Changing who has access to power versus our democracy is eroding. Try to give people some hope. And then I was hoping to hear from people who've been doing this work on, like, what phrases are you using out in the field that you find work for people? And what are some of the things that you've tried that just really don't resonate with people? So if folks have any feedback, I'd love to hear.
I've tried saying the incentive structure in our federal government is incorrect. They're not incentivized to listen to the average citizen.
You get to see my terrible spelling here. Thank goodness for spell check. Yeah, that's great. What else? Any other phrases that are working well for you? So I've got an interesting example from Maine, where we have a ballot measure that's a collection of issues, one of which is the resolution, the state resolution that American Promise works on in different states. Another piece of it is the foreign money piece. And so I have, tend to find that there's certain parts of the bill that resonate with different people. And part of it is like trying to either find phrases that will work on both sides. So just trying to be sort of middle of the road, or trying to analyze who I'm talking to, and then, either focus on the foreign money piece first and use that to get to why it's important to pass the amendment, or vice versa. And so I wanted to, if there are no other responses, I'll just keep going here. I want to get into a little bit more about like what conservative messaging versus progressive messaging. So looking at what specific issues within campaign finance resonate with Republicans versus Democrats. And we've been, as many folks know, we've been working in Pennsylvania as one of our priority states. So we've done a bunch of research recently. This study came out of a survey in Pennsylvania that was done in April. And I think it pretty well reflects what most Americans believe in campaign finance reform. It certainly reflects the other data that we've seen, the other surveys. And so I wanted to share with you what some of those issues are. When you looked at the overall support for limiting campaign spending, it's very much on pace with where we see those percentages elsewhere. Tends to be, mid 60s, maybe low 70s amongst conservatives, low 70s into the 80s for Democrats, and then somewhere in between for independents. Let's see, there's a couple things in particular here. So here we go. The strongest bipartisan consensus is for regulating out-of-state money. And that you'll see is is the biggest concern among conservatives. So if you look at the bar graph down below, you can see which issues, and the Republican bar is the one on bottom on each issue, but which issues resonated most with conservatives. So the issues that tend to poll highest with conservative voters is limiting out-of-state donations and limiting the influence of the biggest donors. And I think that's especially true when you talk about the donors on the left that are spending the most money. Then they care about limiting the amount individuals and organizations can spend, followed by limiting the influence of the biggest spenders, and then the constitutional amendment after that. I do want to point out that the amendment still has into the 60s percentages of support, even though it's one of the lower of the things that conservatives support. So I think especially out-of-state donations is a great place to start when you talk to legislators and referencing those big out-of-state spenders that can come in. And, we really need to keep our elections to the people and to the people of our state. And part of that work is passing this amendment. So some issues there. The full survey is linked at the top if you want to see some more of the issues that they identified as being priorities for folks, conservatives. And then this video by Jim Rubens is incredible. I'm going to link the video. I'm not going to show it. It's 30 minutes, but it's, I think, really valuable. And I would encourage everyone to try to find time to watch it. Jim Rubens, as Marie mentioned earlier, is a Republican, former New Hampshire legislator and governor, and gave this presentation on the conservative case for the constitutional amendment for campaign finance reform, and made some really great cases for why conservatives should support this issue. He gives some background on how all of this, how we got to where we are, what values conservatives have typically cared about, and how that's starting to shift, and the framing when you're talking to a Republican legislator. So I think, understanding these things, absorbing these resources, and being able to put ourselves in the minds of people with differing political views is really helpful when talking to other to candidates and representatives.
Chris, I dropped into the chat, and everybody, I dropped into the chat. Some people had heard about this and some hadn't that I've spoken to recently, but there have been several cases of especially gubernatorial races and some of the battleground Senate races where the Democratic candidate or the outside spending on the Democratic side, let me put it that way, has spent money in the Republican primary to try to shift the chances of winning to the candidate that they see as the most advantageous for the Democrat to run against. And that particular article from NPR details a few of those instances. It happened here in Pennsylvania, actually. The allies supporting Josh Shapiro spent in the gubernatorial side they were trying to get Mastriano nominated. And in fact, Mastriano spent something like $170,000 on TV spending, and the people in support of Josh Shapiro spent something like $870,000. They said he's too conservative for Pennsylvania, which they thought would help the more conservative Republicans support him, and they do view him because he is, kind of out of the mainstream on some of the stop the steal kind of stuff and that kind of thing. They thought he'd be an easier candidate to run against for Josh Shapiro. So, I mean, I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. I just I look at that as kind of dirty politics to be spending in the opposite party's primaries. I mean, talk about letting the voters choose who they want to represent them. But
yeah, and Chris, just to let you know, and I'm sure you know this, is we actually funded a poll in Virginia, but through a university. And actually it was interesting, because as you say, 80% of Virginia, irrespective party, said that the big money donors have too much influence. 88% said they want more disclosure. There was a weird, we did put the constitutional amendment question in there, but maybe it was a complicated question and it needed more detail, because I was disappointed. Only like 59% of the people said we need a constitutional amendment. And when you look at the people who didn't respond, it was 13%, which showed that somehow when you do polling, some questions need a lot more detail and explanation. So it was quite interesting,
Yeah, especially the constitutional amendment thing is, I find even people who are progressives, when they hear that, they do tend to get like hesitant, like, ooh, I don't know, should we be doing that? But I think if we can talk to people about the position that we're in, and we have time to explain the process and really the only way to get to where we want to be, then they come around. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Is certain questions, if they're not framed well, are not going to do as well. And I think looking at the undecideds is a good way to determine that.
May I make a suggestion too? Because when I was looking at a lot of American Promise has these really nice graphics. And when you go to your, the thing that you just showed us, there was a graphic in the beginning that I wanted to take and I wanted to post on Facebook or on Twitter, but I couldn't capture the image. I had to copy it and make a picture myself. And that's the same thing as on the website. There are a lot of really great graphics that we could use on Twitter, but you can't actually just take the graphic. I don't know how, like when you go back, what you were just showing us at the beginning of of the file, I can't take that picture and just copy the picture. I have to take a picture of it and make my own. I take a copy of it and make my own picture and then format it. And then,
that's like something that Jure needs to make easier for us.
Because there are, like the cartoons that you put. That's a great cartoon, but I can't capture it by just, I have to take it and do a page, copy the page, and then format it and make a picture and then save it, so there needs to be something that makes it easy for us to amplify some of these great graphics that you guys put together.
Yeah, I'll ask Jure about it. The reason you couldn't grab the one that I had is because it was a screen share, but you should be able to pull anything off the website, and I'll take a look. You should be able to like right click and save it. And if you're not, then I'll mention it. He may have some sort of restriction on there for some reason and may not know about it.
Yes, because they're great graphics. It's just difficult to use them.
All right, we have a couple of other things to cover, and we actually need to make a choice here at this point. Are we started a little bit late because of the link problem. So should we just, add a couple minutes to the end so we can cover both, or how do you want to handle this?
Yeah, I don't mind skipping the rest of my, oh, sorry. Yeah, we should ask the audience if they don't mind going over a few minutes.
So the two other topics that we want to cover is I have a, not a very long, probably about a 10-minute overall review of how to start to establish a relationship with an editorial board to be able to potentially get a question into an endorsement questionnaire for candidates. And then the other thing we wanted to do was to provide some time for other Q&A of, just any particular problem people are having with the candidate pledge, and just to sort of bat it about and have a discussion of what suggestions other people have, or if they found a solution in the work that they're doing.
I think I'm happy to stay, cover both of them, if you want.
Is that okay with everybody? Okay,
All right.
all right, great.
Board.
So then I'll go ahead and go cover a little bit about getting a question into a candidate endorsement questionnaire. So we want to talk about this because you want to have some lead time to develop a relationship with the editorial staff of the newspaper that you're going to approach before you try to pitch the inclusion of a question into their candidate endorsement questionnaire. Sort of like, you probably want to ask somebody out on a date first before you invite them to the prom, right? So you need a little bit of a relationship development there. So first of all, what you want to do is to investigate which newspapers in your area actually make candidate endorsements for congressional races in your district and state. We've had a problem here in New Jersey where, and I know a lot of parts of the country have had this, where some of the, not super small papers, but some of the medium-sized papers have been bought out. There's been a number of them that have been bought out by Gannett, which is, owns USA Today. Several of the others have all been consolidated under a statewide newspaper network. And so there's not quite the same, where 5 years ago when we started to do this, we would pretty easily get letters to the editor in the paper and so on. And there was an editor we could talk to. That's not the case anymore. So you do need to figure out who actually does these endorsements and who has editors that you can actually talk to develop this relationship. I'm going to look at which papers do it, which elected offices do they actually write endorsements for, and what issues have they covered previously when they've endorsed candidates. And that's really, that's just research, internet research. So then, basically, just like with getting op-eds published, the people who pretty much are the most successful are the ones that have a relationship already with the editor or the op-ed editor. So you want to look up whichever papers are that you're going to target, look up and see who do you need to target, who you're going to have to try to call or contact. They might have an editor who plays the role of deciding whether both op-eds and editorials get put in, or they might have a separate op-ed editor for op-eds and then an editorial board editor. You just kind of have to look, Google it or look at the bottom of their website page in the contact us or the managing board and the masthead staff directory to see how they assign those responsibilities. And if you just really can't figure it out, I would say call and ask, hey, this is what I'd like to do. Who do I talk to? And they can connect you to the right person then. Excuse me. You want to, when you figure out who it is that you're supposed to be contacting, you really do want to make an intention of speaking to them. It's fine to send a short email too, even before you speak to them, but you do definitely want to try to speak to them. So when you're pitching, when you're making a proposal about whatever it is that you're making the proposal for, whether it be an op-ed or an editorial, or eventually including a question in a candidate pledge questionnaire, you want to be effective and you want to cover these basic questions. You want to say, give the answer to the question, well, why now? What's the news hook? Why is this worth covering right now? Now that would be more for an op-ed or an editorial, but obviously that's, that's, why is it newsworthy? Why should they put the time into putting this in the paper? Why this topic? Why should people care? And that goes back to all of our reasons for working on the amendment that we work on. And then this part would be more for you writing an op-ed. Why you? Why are you the best one to write this particular op-ed about this issue? That's not so much of an issue for the editorial or for the question, but then you want to say, well, why New Jersey American Promise, or why Virginia American Promise, why Delaware American Promise? Why should they, why should they prioritize what we're working on? You want to make sure you have your idea down to a few lines and your relevant credentials, and of course your contact information and the email. When you call the editor, it's always a good idea to sort of have your email open and accessible, so that if you can ask, hey, I sent an email to you saying, proposing this idea. Did you see it? And they could say no, which, just like when we call candidates about the candidate pledge, they can say, nope, I didn't see it. So then you can have it right there. Say, oh, well, can I just verify that this is the correct email address to send it to? I'll send it to you again right now. Just have it all lined up, have it all set up. And then it's good to be ready for a little conversation with them, basically reviewing through what you put in your email, saying, we're working on advancing an amendment to regulate unlimited money, and we are have been working on candidate pledge requests and to support this amendment, and we would like to highlight the fact that voters care about this by A, asking for an editorial to be put in, or B, pitching your op-ed that you've written, or C, including a question in your candidate endorsement questionnaire. And if you're all the way to the point where you're going to ask them about that question being inserted, then you want to say, this is the question we would like to have included in your questionnaire. How would we go about getting approval for that question to be included? And see what they have to say. Or are you the right person to speak to about that? You maybe have spoken to somebody initially about an op-ed previously, and so it would be worthwhile maybe to start with them and ask, who is the right person for me to talk to about this? We're really interested in highlighting the importance of this as a voting issue, and the fact that we have, this number of candidates that have signed on to our pledge. So we really believe that this would be a good topic for you to cover, good issue for you to cover in your candidate endorsement questionnaire. And then I'm just going to close. Like I said, I just was going to do a very brief review of this for tonight. It's always better to initiate a relationship ahead. So if you're thinking that you're up to drafting an op-ed and pitching an op-ed, even if they maybe don't accept the op-ed for publishing right now, there's still a little bit of a relationship that you've started there. And then you have time, because obviously endorsements come out a little bit later, probably not until mid to late September, early October, approximately. I'm just guesstimating it's a little bit later, right? So you have a little more time to develop that relationship a little further, to possibly make progress on getting a question inserted. Or hopefully one of the things that we sort of have on the back burner is to, from American Promise, to have some information developed for an edit, as like a one-pager to pitch editorials, possibly to be written, by editorial boards. So maybe they wouldn't be able to put a question in their candidate questionnaire, but maybe they would agree to writing an editorial, which also would be very powerful and a big win for us in our work. The letter to the editor training that will be later this week on July 28th will be covering writing and submitting op-eds. And I believe that Chris just dropped the registration link in the chat. That's in 2 weeks. So come meet us there if you want to hear more about the op-eds. Any questions?
Thanks, Marie. I think that's really interesting. And I know that Sam was talking about it. Do we have any examples where we've actually, that has been successful? Have you been successful in New Jersey in engaging?
Honestly, no, we have not done that before. We've had op-eds published, but we have not worked on getting a question into an endorsement questionnaire. But like one of the things that when we started talking back in March, Chris, was it March? We said, well, how can we improve the candidate pledge initiative? Well, we've worked on this, to varying degrees because of the pandemic in 2020. We started in 2018, and we've worked on getting candidate pledges, but we need to be, other than just saying to the candidate, oh, you can use this pledge graphic, we should be able to parlay that into something else for the movement. And another thing to do for the movement is to make the acquisition of these candidate pledges into a selling point and a PR point for the general public, right? How can we do that? Well, unearned, without paying for it. One way we can do it is by, possibly getting it into an endorsement write-up by a newspaper, or certainly, by getting op-eds and editorials done. So those are, more things that we need to do to advance our advocacy. So we're trying to include them.
Hmm.
And then just a suggestion for Chris, because I just went on the events calendar for American Promise, and the letter to the editor thing isn't up there. So, and it's weird because then I get these emails saying we're having a meeting with Jeff. I thought it was on the 28th, because there were somehow, when we signed up at one point for American Connect or something, we're getting these emails that these events are happening that actually aren't going to happen. So I think we need to sort of
There's some work that needs to be done with that. There's still some disconnect between the calendar and how the messages are going out that hopefully will be ironed out.
Yeah, appreciate the feedback. I wanted to just touch on something that we had talked about, and it actually gets into Joan's question here about debates and forums. That part of this process was inspired by the getting a question into the debate in the 2020 Senate campaign in Maine. And what happened there is I believe the station had an opportunity for people to submit what they wanted to ask of the candidates. And so being in tune with like these news stations, being up to speed with what they're putting out there, you can actually sometimes find that they're putting out requests to hear what readers or what people care about. And that's an opportunity to just flood in as many responses as you can. And that's what they did here. And they were able to get a question specifically about the amendment to really put pressure on these legislators on the public debate stage to answer. So I think the same thing with newspapers. I think that if you're following what's going on with them, and maybe if they have social media pages or websites, just like keeping an eye out for opportunities to submit those.
And I like Kim's suggestion to suggest a question on the amendment to the state League of Women Voters for candidates for the 411 voter guide. I hadn't thought about that before. That's a great idea.
Yeah, they may not choose to use your wording as one. So in 2020, we got a question on campaign finance reform into our, but it didn't mention the amendment. They generalized it, but
yeah.
This year we didn't get one at all in Delaware.
Well, it's also because the League of Women Voters nationally, they backed away from them supporting the constitutional amendment. They support campaign finance, but they originally did support an amendment, and now I don't know. Weird.
Well,
yeah, but the state LWV has control over what questions they want to ask their state candidates, so they may or may not, be willing to go there.
Yeah, definitely worth a shot. Well, we wanted to just spend a couple minutes here at the end to answer questions and address any issues that people are facing, or share in some of the successes if they'd like to talk about that. We did have one person submit a question through email that I wanted to bring up now, and then we can open things up to anyone else who has questions or comments. The question was, essentially that the chapter has been trying to, get as many pledges as possible, and have noticed that some of the graphics and quotes are not ideal from some of the people that they're getting pledges from. So they're wondering if we can cover quantity versus quality of candidates who sign. So, do we want 100 pledge signers, or even if some of them are a bit on the fringe and maybe don't really understand our issue all that well, and submit an unrelated quote for their graphic? Or would we prefer a smaller number of quality, respected legislators to sign and make a coherent statement? So I think it's an excellent question. And as we talked about at the top of the meeting, it is really important to have a strategy on which people we need to pull in. And it's not just Democrats. Like, we need to be strategic about which legislators, and our strategy in pulling those legislators into the movement. And so I think that and essentially right at the end, we need these people to vote to support the amendment, whether they're in Congress or if they're in the state legislature. So if they don't understand the issue well, if they maybe they have like one part of campaign finance that they're hyper focused on, that may not necessarily mean that when this comes up for a vote that they're going to in fact support it. So I really do believe in quality over quantity. And in one example, and I'll be quick, is here in Maine, is when I'm collecting signatures, sometimes you'll get somebody who only, they've heard about the foreign money piece, but they don't know about the amendment. And so they hear about the foreign money piece and they just want to sign the petition. And on my part, it would be easy to just say, oh, thanks. And just like, thanks for the signature. I don't want to tell you about, I don't want to talk myself out of a signature, so I'm not going to tell you anymore. But, it's so important to really have the conversation about the full work and what it means, so that, they understand the amendment, and when it comes up, they'll be informed about it. And I think it's the same thing with legislators. You may have someone who's just thinks, we got to do something about the dark money, and I'm willing to sign the pledge. But if they don't know really what we're asking them to do, then it doesn't really solve the problem. And then I think also the question is asking whether or not, some candidates can actually hurt our cause. And that is true too. And we do have a process for reviewing quotes. So when a quote comes in and it's just like, where if it was something that we wouldn't want the public seeing, we would not post it on the site. And sometimes you can work with candidates too to try to get a better quote and really help guide them in that process. So, that's another thing we can do. So, overall, doing all of that work is not, it is a lot of work, and it may reduce your total number of pledges, but I think overall will be more supportive to the end goal.
I think you might be surprised though at, I could tell you that 2 of the 3 websites of the candidates that I showed at the beginning that are Republican pledge signers, I would never have predicted that they would even be interested, or that their quotes would be so on target. So sometimes it's hard if you have a partisan lens and you're looking at what they're writing on the website, you might think, oh, they don't really understand, or what have you. It's not, you don't want to be biased. I think you need to be open-minded about the more signers we have, the more signers we have. And maybe they wouldn't eventually sign, when it comes to actually the rubber hits the road and there's an amendment ratified, and now, it needs to be ratified when it comes back to the state or whatever, but they're at least willing to put their neck out and say, yeah, if elected, I'm willing to do that.
But that's why I think it's important, because I try to talk to candidates and I'll say, okay, I'll ask them to I'll give them sample quotes. But one candidate I know, he said, oh, we sent it through the link, and I said, oh, okay. But the quote wasn't good. You know, I mean, the quote could have been better. And so that's why, in a funny way, I'd prefer to work with them and come up with a good quote rather than saying, oh, you can put your quote, send your picture and your quote to this link. Because sometimes we want to use them for letters to the editor if they're good and stuff like that. But if they're, you know, and that's why I think it's really important to work with them.
It is tough. And I prefer to work with the candidates and submit it because then I know it's been submitted and I can look for it to come back. But on the other hand, this is a democracy and people do have their right of expression, right? So that's what we're fighting for. So I think, maybe, guiding them through it a little bit is a good thing to do.
Yeah, and it also will help you continue that relationship building. That's really important, is just like being able to offer them a little support and continuing to have conversations and connection with those people is really valuable.
So what I want to mention very quickly, what we did was, because we had this cross-partisan candidate panel back in March, particularly when I've spoken to any of the new signers, I've said to them, look, we had a cross-partisan candidate panel talking about what their impressions of and about the problems about money in politics and the work for the amendment. Would you be interested, later on in the campaign cycle, to possibly participate in a candidate panel? And so we did have buy-in from the 3 new Republican pledge signers, and now we're going to we're actually going to do a Republican candidate panel. Now, they did all lose their primaries, but that's okay. There's still Republicans who can reach out to their networks that we haven't had access to very much before, and hopefully we'll be able to bring in more volunteers and and get the word out more that way.
And Chris, just one final question that I brought up and it came up in the discussion with Micah. I don't know when it was, and this, this because Hank had come up from Michigan, had come up with a proposal, is those of our legislators that have already co-sponsored the bills, all of them whom are Democrats, but is it possible to get something, some type of thank you, so we don't have to go back to them to get ask them for a quote? I mean,
can we defer that till after finish, if there's any other questions, and defer that until we're done with the recording?
Sure, and we can discuss it with Mike tomorrow too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure I would be able to answer it. Kim?
So I had a question. If we notice, it's great that the database is up now, the searchable database with all the candidate names. If we notice an error, should we funnel that through you, Chris, or is there someone else we should tell? Like, there's one that has a name issue and one that's got the wrong year up there.
Yeah, there's actually if you don't mind, Trinket, there is a website request form.
Okay.
Drop in the chat, and it's super easy. You just put in like you put in the link to the site you're on and what the problem is, and it automatically goes into Jeray's to-do list, and he'll fix it. And it's the easiest and fastest way to get stuff done.
Perfect.
That is the form for all who have any website issues.
Do we have to remember this, or is there something, is it on the website? Is it on the website where you can click and?
No, because it's not publicly available. We don't want it to be widely available. We only want it to be available to people within our network. So if you ever lose it and need it, you can ask me and I'll resend it. What I've done is I open it and bookmark it so it's handy. But if you lose access, Mike, Jeray, or I can send it to you.
Maybe you could put it in our the candidate pledge thing, so at least it's someplace to look for it.
Yeah, I can definitely put it in the handbook.
We'll cut and paste it into a Word doc. I mean, what I tend to do is have a Word doc that has notes, which I'm like typing on through these things. And you just highlight it, Control C, take it over, Control V.
That's great. Other questions from folks? What are there specific things that people are struggling on or would like to know more about? Are there topics for future discussions that people would really like to hear, even if we can't give you the full training now? This last bit here is for you, so any way we can support you.
I'd like to thank you for addressing the messaging issue and putting that in, because I think a lot of our members in Virginia are saying we need to have training on messaging. And so that, I think that's very helpful. You know, the words to use, not to use, which are conservative, which are liberal. So thanks for that.
And that's just scratching the surface. We almost didn't even cover that today because we really want more in-depth and full coverage about it. But we thought that because things have been on a delayed timeline recently, that we should offer you some stuff that we at least, you know, that Marie and I come up with in a reasonable time to share with you. But there's going to be a more robust effort with Jim Rubens and Alan to come together and put you know, documents and resources together that'll give us more more resources like that.
I want to just confirm or support what Nancy just said, because those messaging things, I had that right in front of me when I was creating emails to request candidate pledges during the primaries. It was very helpful.
And where is that table that you had? It's not in the handbook, right?
So
It wasn't-
everything,
Yeah, the one that said, use this, not that.
Yes.
That is linked under general messaging in
okay.
the handbook.
And just because we have no resource guide now, it seems to have disappeared. And I take your handbook and then I save it, but it's not the up-to-date handbook. So I'm never quite sure if I don't make a link someplace to it, I don't have the most recent handbook.
Isn't the handbook linked to the getting a pledge or the basic information about the candidate pledge in the website, I believe?
Is it?
I believe.
I thought it was a resource for us.
yeah, unless I didn't request that it was linked on the website, but it's totally possible that it was put up there. Yeah, so a lot, and you know, a lot of this stuff's going to change. We're really trying to get out of Google Docs. Google Docs are great for some things. They're good for collaborating, but we can't just live in a million different Google Docs. So Mike and Dre and Sally and others are working on implementing new software. We tested one yesterday called Circle. It turns out to not be the ideal tool. We're looking at others that are implemented with Salesforce, but we're close to having a place where these resources will be available, sort of like the Drive or the resource library or the candidate handbook, but with a much more user-friendly interface. So you'll just be able to go in and click candidate pledge work, and there'll be all the candidate pledge resources and trainings right there. It's not going to happen overnight, but we're not that far from it. I'd say within, you know, the next month or so, we should have at least the software started, if not built out. There's already some stuff happening. So I think, you know, saving the links and bookmarking them and all that is great for now, but eventually all this stuff will be in one place, and we'll have a place to communicate with each other as well.
So should we close the recording and then
Sure.
if we can say goodnight and thank you so much for joining us. And our next meeting is August 11th. Correct?
That's correct.
All right.
Yeah. Thanks everyone for joining. Stop the recording.
you.